Thanks for joining us for part two of a multi-part short presentation series on the work of AIW in the schools. This series is focused on transformational change with schools doing authentic intellectual work. And in part one, we talked about what is AIW. And in this part, we're going to be talking with Dr. Bruce King, one of the co-founders of the Center for AIW, on what the research tells us about teacher practice. Research about practice. Dr. King, tell us just for a moment here about this framework and what educators need to understand before we take a look at the study that you did regarding special ed and non-special ed students.
Thanks, Deanna. There's a body of research that goes from the early 1990s all the way through to 2009, both in the United States and now in Australia, that consistently shows that when teachers challenge students with tasks and lessons of high intellectual quality, that student performance is both higher and more equitable across student groups. And that achievement is true, that higher levels of achievement is true for both standardized measures of student performance as well as performance-based measures. It's a consistent body of research in different locations in terms of rural, suburban, and urban high schools, and true for almost all student demographic groups.
So in this case, I'm going to bring up here for our folks to look at a particular study that you were involved in regarding authentic performance for students with and without disabilities in classes. Tell us about the graph that we're taking a look at here.
In the early 2000s, we conducted a multi-year study and an in-depth case study of 4 high schools in different parts of the United States that were, to a significant degree, including students with disabilities in general education classrooms. And one of our important research questions was, to what extent were students, both general ed students and students with disabilities, exposed to high levels of authentic pedagogy, that is, lessons and assignments and assessment tasks that met criteria for authentic intellectual work? To what extent were these students exposed to authentic pedagogy, and what was the result of that in terms of student performance on important assessment tasks in their classrooms? And what we find here, that when, consistent with the other studies, when both general ed and students with disabilities had higher levels of expectations in their assignments that they were given, that their student performance increased. And in fact, students with disabilities outperformed general ed students when they had higher levels of authentic tasks.
So let me just ask you a couple questions about the graph. What you just said now, that's a very important statement, and I'm thinking that the red circle is really highlighting that difference. What feels intuitive is that you have students without disabilities, shown in the green, in both contexts outperforming students with disabilities. But like what you just said, the students with the disabilities, the 7.5 indicator on the right side, those kids actually did better than the students 5.6 without disabilities who were in those lower performing classes. Am I getting it right?
Yes, that's absolutely true. We don't see the achievement gaps disappear, but I think we all could agree that the performance of students with disabilities on the right side of the graph is much more positive than what we're seeing on the left side of the graph, even for students without disabilities.
And tell me what these scale score numbers mean.
This is not a standardized test. This is rating on actual student work that was done on important assessment tasks given in their classroom. So we collected a series of assessment tasks, multiple samples from each teacher, and collected the student work on those tasks. And so this is the score of the student work on tasks that were handed in as part of the research study.
And these teachers never had any exposure to AIW professional development, is that right?
That's correct, and that's why we see a range of quality in terms of teachers' assessments and assignments and lessons across the different classrooms at these 4 high schools.
What's interesting for me about this, just in closing here, is that what it really shows is that there are teachers out there that are naturally following on an intuitive level the tenets of what AIW represents in framework. And so we can look, it actually just reinforces that as a parent of a child with disability, I might know that certain teachers are really the teachers I want to have my student with, as opposed to other teachers that just aren't going to be offering those high expectations. This really supports that notion that teachers are important.
That's true, but I'll also mention in that regard, Dana, that across all these studies, high-end instruction and high-end assessment tasks was few and far between. Yes, there are great teachers out there. Most schools have at least some of them, but unfortunately, and consistent with this body of research as well as other bodies of research, we know that the amount of intellectual rigor that's asked of students across the country in all sorts of different schools by most teachers is quite low.
So I know we're not going to talk about it in this conversation, but as a precursor to the next part in the series, are we hopeful that if teachers learn about the framework for authentic pedagogy and engage in that scoring process, that they can change the quality of their instruction? We can get more teachers over on the right-hand side of that graph?
Absolutely. And we're seeing that thanks to over 6 years of work in the state of Iowa, as well as in different schools and in districts in Minnesota, Georgia, New York, as well as Wisconsin. When there's a particular program of professional development to encourage teachers to examine and improve their instruction and their assessments to advance standards for authentic intellectual work, their practice does change, and we know that when students are exposed to higher levels of authentic pedagogy, their performance increases.
Wow, great news. Thanks for chatting, Bruce.
Thank you.
Yep.